Hello, this is Dan Henson with Sunbiz Studios, my partner Marius Mokan. We have another great business here in Sarasota. We have US 1031 Exchange. We have Ryan Stolman. Stolman.
Like
so we'll just go with it. It was Ryan Stolman. Okay, so welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Marius. I appreciate the opportunity coming in today and talking about 1031 exchanges. It's a great tool out there for investors.
So let's talk about how you guys, how we got to this point. Marius, why don't you kind of tell us how we got here?
Yeah, so me being my chatty self, I was in the line at Fresh Kitchen here at UTC, and I looked over at Ryan, who's in front of me in line, and I saw his 1031
great shirt right
yep, 1031. I'm like, oh, you do 1031 exchanges? How about getting on doing some video? And he shows me that he's got his own channel going, and I thought it was really great. I really like working with people and bringing people in that like to educate, because that's what we do here. So thank you for joining us today.
No, I appreciate it. And like I said, a big part of the 1031 is really educating those investors out there, realtors out there, anyone who has that investment property, and just kind of showing them what's available for them, to be able to do that 1031 exchange and defer taxes when they sell.
So since you have your own site, you we'll throw it on the screen here. What is the contact to that? What is your channel?
Oh, so it's usually it's just US 1031 exchange services. So we have our own YouTube channel, also our social media on Facebook and Instagram as well. So
okay.
yeah,
we'll make sure we have all that information,
Absolutely.
the link in the video, and obviously have for yours too. So I guess the quickest thing to get into before we get into kind of how you got there is just what is a 1031 exchange?
Right. Yeah. So a 1031 exchange is it's in the IRS tax code. It's been in the tax code for over 100 years. And what it does is allows investors, people who have investment property or property used in a trade or business, commercial property, when they sell that property, they can actually defer capital gains tax as long as they reinvest those proceeds in other like-kind property, so other investment property or commercial property. And so it's a great tool from both a wealth building, estate planning aspect, and being able to reallocate and use those dollars that might be lost for taxes to have those funds available so that you can reinvest right into new real estate in that regard. So it's a great tool there for investors in real estate.
Right. And I think the biggest thing, just like when people, do they need a realtor? Or do they need this? Do they do that? It's always best to have the professional. I mean, you do this every day.
Right. Yeah. It's every day. The beauty is it's allows people to diversify, right? So they can sell here in Florida and buy in Texas. They can sell in New York and buy here in Florida. So it's a great tool that they can use across the nation. There's some specifics and rules that go into play, but having a qualified intermediary such as ourselves is one of the big things you do need to be able to facilitate the 1031 exchange.
Okay.
It's very important, because the moment that money touches your account,
it's a taxable sale.
Taxable event.
Correct.
And
yes.
that's very important to have you make sure that every step of the process is done right and legal.
Correct. Yeah. So, part of the process first and foremost is you have to enter into that exchange agreement, the escrow agreement with the qualified intermediary prior to the sale of the property. And so the big thing too with the 1031 is receipt and constructive receipt of funds. And that's where you have that third party neutral qualified intermediary that has to be in play to hold those funds on your behalf. So as the sale occurs, those funds, instead of you receiving those funds, they would come to us to hold on your behalf. We then use those funds towards the purchase of your replacement property, and that eliminates the receipt and constructive receipt of funds, which would eliminate the ability to do a 1031 altogether in there. So,
can you explain? And I know because I do a lot of them. Can you explain to everybody how the process is? Like, I know there's time frames that have to be hit because it instantly kills everything if you don't hit your time marks.
Correct. Yeah. So one of the big things is the time frames with that as well. So upon the sale of the property you're selling or properties you're selling, so a lot of people, there's a misconception that it's only one property, and that's not the case. If you have multiple properties, we can look at doing the exchange a couple different ways with those properties, whether it's separate exchanges or all in one exchange as well. So upon the sale of that, that's what really kicks off your time frame. So there's two big dates that people need to be aware of. You have your 45-day identification period and your 180-day exchange period. All that 45 is within that 180-day.
Right.
So that 45-day, identification period to formally identify a replacement property or properties, and then you have to close on one or more of those replacement properties within the 180 days to be able to have an effective exchange and complete the exchange. And one of the big things is those deadlines are set in concrete. There's really no extension of those deadlines outside of a federally declared disaster.
Right.
And so, a lot of people that have to understand those deadlines. If it's on a weekend, it's a weekend. It doesn't bump to the next weekday.
You hit my next question already.
So if Saturday's your 45th day, we need it by 11:59 on that Saturday from that point.
Okay.
So midnight. The beauty is the timeline doesn't start until the actual sale occurs. So we always encourage people, if you know you're going to do a 1031 and you have this date of when you're going to sell, your closing date, start looking for your replacement property sooner, right? There's nothing that says you can't look for it sooner. There's nothing saying you can't go under contract. The identification is a formal identification. So if you do go under contract, we just now have that as your identified property, and you're all set. And so you're not rushed by that 45 day. A lot of people think, what happens before? Am I conscried? Is that 45 day is going to come pretty quick.
Right.
People don't realize that, and different markets dictate how things are going. And so that's the big thing. We always say, encourage people to start the process early, understand what the rules are, understand the timeline, so and have that plan of action, that you can work with the realtor, and even us working with the realtor. Hey, here's the deadline that's going to happen. Play it out. Hey, we're closing this date. You have until this date, so start in advance and everything like that. So, yeah.
So, the 45 day.
Correct.
Because I'm actually going to probably be dealing with some of this stuff soon because we got these commercial properties. So, on the 45 day, say at day 15, I identify.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going through our process, and we're going through our inspections, and we're under contract, and then we are out.
You back out of the deal.
Back out of the deal.
Right.
So I'm still in that 45-day window to still find something else, or does it start over?
Correct. So you're still within the 45-day window. So again, there's a couple identification rules that can occur within that 45-day. We have what's called the 3 property rule. So you can actually identify up to 3 properties. You might just want to buy one, but you have 2 other ones that you want to identify just in case, regardless of value, that you can identify. And then you also have what's called the 200% rule. So if you want to identify more than 3 properties, 4 or more, you can identify those as long as the total aggregate value doesn't exceed 200% of what you're selling.
Gotcha.
If you go over that 200%, the IRS then says, okay, we have this 95% rule, and we're going to make you buy 95% of all the properties you've identified. So in essence, you got to buy everything.
Right.
But as long as you're within that 45-day, you can revoke your list and change your list and say, hey, we have 123 Main Street, 456 Main Street, and 789 Main Street, and I want to cancel 123 Main Street. Great. We can revoke that, and you can replace it with something else. It's just as long as you're in that 45-day window, you can keep changing the properties out as long as we're within those identification rules. It's just as soon as you hit midnight on day 45, you need
to be under contract with something.
Not necessarily under contract. You're stuck with what you've identified.
Oh, okay. You can't change your identification. So,
correct.
So that answers my next question. So say I pick 3 properties, like, hey, I really like this street. I'm going to hit these 3 and figure which one works out. I don't have to have a contract on them. I just have to identify that this is what I'm going for. This is what I'm trying to do. You have it registered. I'm hitting 123, 124, 126.
Correct. Yeah. Don't have to be under contract, but obviously you can see what happens if you're not under contract, right? Seller can still sell 123, Main Street out from you. You're not under contract. They have every right to do that. And so there's some tools. We work with realtors on how you can negotiate certain things like that. But yes, within that 45, you don't necessarily have to be under contract. It's just formally identifying on paper that these are the properties that we want to use for the exchange.
Okay.
Yeah.
What if I want to use one of these homes as my primary property down the road? And, we've got that whole thing where, up to $250,000 of your, or $500,000.
For now, who knows, that might change.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Everything here can change, okay? It's liable to change. So you always have to call Ryan to find out the latest rules. But, for married couple, it's up to $500,000. No capital gains on your primary sale, right? When can I move into one of these properties and call it my primary, and then also still take advantage of these tax exemptions?
So one of the big things to understand is the 1031 is for investment property or property used in a trade or business.
Right.
Primary residences don't qualify because that has its own separate 121 exclusion that probably is even a better benefit, from that, because it's excluding it, not necessarily deferring it, right? Like the 1031. And also something to keep in mind, under certain types of restrictions, second homes and vacation homes necessarily don't qualify unless they meet certain safe harbor guidelines in that regard. So investment property or commercial property, anytime property is in the trade or business, both the property you're selling and the property you're purchasing have to be for investment and used in that trade or business. Now, what happens if intent changes and something later down the line changes? You know, that's when you discuss with the CPA, hey, I have this investment property, I'm retiring, or I no longer want to have it as investment, I want to move into it, make my primary, you know, what options are available along those lines. And usually that's with the CPA to kind of discuss and say, okay, we've had this investment property, it's been 2-3 years from that point. You know, if you decide to move into it, you might be good and everything. Everyone's situation's a little bit different with that, so it's always deferring back to the CPA to make sure they understand. Because then, once you make it your primary, there's those other things that you can't report it anymore as an investment. You can't take those deductions and the depreciation anymore. So you always want to make sure the CPA is on board so that the tax returns then adjust accordingly, you know, from that in that regard. So.
Is it so a normal CPA would know? So, for instance, as you hit. I have an investment property. We've had it for 10 years in the mountains of North Carolina.
Right.
And now, you know, we had already 1031 into it. We're good. And now we're like, hey, I think we're just going to live up there. Right. So, you know, we're moving over. And then that's where the CPA and does your company get involved, or is it they just look at your records?
They just, as long as you're not doing another 1031, we don't need to be involved. It's just usually with the CPA to kind of recognize that, change how it starts to get reported, you know, from that end. Right. You know, 10 years down the line, you're probably safe to that occur because you know, then you're looking at when you sell that as your primary, that's when the other things occur, you know, down the line, right? Because that's the taxable event that occurs that will eventually report any kind of sale. And so you're looking at what's the use, the intent and use of the property when you go to sell it in that regard. What you don't want to do is sell your investment property, do a 1031, buy your replacement property, and move right in.
Yeah.
That will,
red flags everywhere.
That's red flags across the IRS.
Defeats the whole purpose.
Right.
And the CPA might say, yeah, no, I'm not reporting that for you. So, you know, you're going to pay the taxes on that one.
Yeah,
exactly.
Pay the tax man.
So can we talk about rolling it into a real estate investment trust?
Sure. Yeah. So ideally, you can sell the investment property. A real estate investment trust doesn't satisfy the like-kind requirement under the IRS regulations, as you're buying shares into this real estate investment trust. What does, though, is there's something that is essentially along the same lines of a real estate, a REIT there. And it's called a Delaware Statutory Trust, a DST. And that's where you're actually buying a percentage of beneficial interest into this trust, which underlie who owns the property. And it could be a bunch of warehouses. It could be a bunch of industrial complexes. It could be one property. It could be multiple properties, you know, healthcare facilities, student housing, senior living facilities, a bunch of commercial properties all in one portfolio. And again, those could be across the nation. It's not necessarily in one area across the nation. And so you're buying that percentage interest. And the IRS has ruled that the Delaware Statutory Trust, or the DST, actually satisfies this like-kind requirement that you would need to help satisfy a 1031 exchange. And so from that end, investing in the DST is the option you would go, not necessarily a REIT. And so there's some pros and cons to a DST, which probably is a whole nother topic of conversation along those lines that occur with that. But that allows you to keep that 1031 deferral going in place. It's just then, you know, there's some options after that, whether you want to go into a REIT or not, you know, from that end. But the REIT itself doesn't actually satisfy the like-kind requirement that's required for the 1031.
Yeah, that gets really convoluted really quick. So with all that just said, so I'm a basic investor now. I have a couple commercial properties, a couple residential properties. And then my wife and myself, we're talking about a trust, right? First time we talked to somebody at trust, they go, you don't have enough money to do a trust. Don't do it. And I was like, okay, I didn't even know anything about it. But now we're kind of getting older. We're getting these properties. We're kind of like, okay, set a trust up. So you're talking about REITs, and then you talk about trust, and you talk about 1031. And so the best person to kind of help you work that avenue out kind of fits perfectly into what my wife were talking about. Do we talk to your wife who's a real estate attorney? Do we talk to a CPA? Do we talk to you? Or is it a combination, obvious, of all? But, you know, how do you start kind of figuring the plan out because, like you said, and same thing we do in real estate, everybody's different.
Right.
People are like, oh, we don't need an agent. Well, your problem might need an agent. Some people don't need an agent. If you're an experienced, investor, you probably don't need us,
Right.
but if you're trying to figure an area out or you want to know what's going on, you're not experienced at it, we do. I'm not experienced 1031. I mean, I've done some, but I've never done it personally.
Right.
I'm not going to try to figure it out on the internet, so I'm coming to you. Same thing with that whole process of figuring all that stuff out. So where do you recommend somebody starts?
So I think our recommendation is always start with the CPA and your attorney, right? Because the type of trust you want to do, the attorney is going to know that. But obviously going into a certain type of trust, there's probably some tax things that you need to be considered of. And so then that's when you bring in the CPA to understand, hey, if we go into this trust, however that might be, the type of trust, what are the tax implications, not how can we sell out and so forth like that. So, usually it's having that team that you're going to need from everybody, attorneys or other tax, professionals that deal with those type of trust and how to report things along those lines. Because that really dictates a lot, right? How you going into the trust, what are you bringing into the trust, and that's where the attorney would say, what's your goal, right? What's the whole purpose of you wanting to go in this trust, the beneficiaries, and everything that goes along with that. We come into play just from the sales standpoint, so it's good to know what you're putting into it because that could then play out later. What's the long-term goal when you play that out later down the line, and how that comes into play. So those are things that people want to start thinking about when they start doing these things and putting things in the trust like that. So really it's start with the CPA and their attorney that's going to draft that trust and do the things along those lines, because there's a lot of more nuances that, that attorneys have to know about.
We can do a 1031 exchange as an individual, but what happens when we step into the realm of multiple partners, LLCs, things of that nature? Does that get a little bit more complicated, or what's that process?
It can be with that process. So the 1031, the taxpayer, we look at who the taxpayer is that owns the property or that's been reporting the property. So obviously we can do it as an individual. We could do it as a husband and wife. You can do it if you own the property in an LLC, whether that's a single member LLC, disregarded entity, or whether it's a multi-member LLC where there's multiple partners in that LLC. You could do it as a corporation if you have a corporation that owns the property. There's some things, your CPA might say that's probably not a good idea, along those lines. You could do it if you own the property in the trust, whether it's a joint revocable or irrevocable trust, along those lines. And so one of the big requirements with the 1031 is the same taxpayer requirements. The way you sell the property individually as husband and wife is the way you have to purchase the replacement property, take title to that replacement property to satisfy that same taxpayer requirement. And so when you have a multi-member LLC, some things come into play, and they're like, well, what if the partners want to go different ways? What do we do? What happens, right? Because in the end, you got to remember that LLC is the one that's been reporting it. That's the taxpayer. That's the exchanger. So then we have some processes in play where you then have to drop out of the LLC. So those members who might want to do a 1031 or those who want to cash out, we drop them out of the LLC and you get into this tenant in common interest. So we call it a drop and swap. So you drop out of the LLC. Whoever wants to do the 1031 can then do the 1031 with their interest. And then whoever wants to cash out can then cash out and take the tax hit along those lines there. So that's what we have is the drop and swap along those lines there. And the beauty is, from an estate planning standpoint, as it stands currently, there's no regulation on how many 1031s you could do over your lifetime. So what we have is the drop till you, or the swap till you drop.
Okay.
And then at which case then you can continue doing a 1031. You're swapping till you die. Right. So, and then eventually everything gets passed along to your heirs that stepped up in basis along those lines. So that also comes into play when we were talking about the estate planning aspect of it, putting things in trust. How does that work? What would happen? So you have that swap till you drop aspect of it.
So the trust is the entity that is in 1031. So say we have a trust and we're buying property in it. That's the entity it's doing it. So everything has to happen in that. But if I die,
then based on looking at how the trust is,
whoever the, I guess, beneficiary, well, I don't know if they call it beneficiary. They do call it beneficiary? Okay. Beneficiary in that trust would just keep going with that process?
Well, they then inherit the property based on the rules of the trust, how the trust is agreed upon and written. and then they have the option to either, if they want to continue with it,
Right.
to then sell it or
Right.
keep it, and
Keep
then
going
eventually
with it.
do their own 1031. You know, the big thing with that is they get that stepped up in basis that occurs. So the original cost, the value becomes the day of death. So everything done prior gets wiped away
Right.
in those regards. So
You know, it's amazing how far you can go down rabbit holes with real estate questions, you know, and we have your wife as an attorney in here for real estate, and she's just laughing over there because as things come up, it's like two more things come up. I mean, it looks like we have a lot of conversations that we can have, just trying to help, because so many people move to Florida as investments. And, you know, I think that most of my properties are, I'd say 80% cash. So it does come from a lot of 1031. I have 3 or 4 people have done multiple 10, 11 properties each through the 1031. So it's a very good tool for investors.
yeah, it's a great tool. Generational wealth is what I think a lot of people look at now. So when you have these investment properties and maintaining it, you know, having that to know that it's going to eventually go to your heirs, you've built this portfolio up.
Right.
You know, that's what it comes down to, is building generational wealth for yourself, for your family, to continue that process. And one of the great tools with the 1031 is that diversification, right? So, I have this investment property. It's located in New York, and now I'm getting hit with taxes and the regulations and all this. If I can sell it, now I'm going to get hit with taxes. Can I do a 1031? And that allows you to diversify. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to move out of New York and move it to Florida, where I'm living. It's a lot closer. Or I can sell that condo and buy a commercial building. So now I'm diversifying my portfolio over asset classes as well. So not only geographically, but asset classes as well. And so, you know, it helps along those lines for a better return that people can look at.
I did have a client that that sold $1 million condo in New York during the height of the market, and they came down and bought 3 houses.
Yeah.
It was great for her.
All right, Ryan. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. What does this all cost?
Yeah,
Sounds really good, but what is it going to cost
I
me?
think it, cost wise, you know, most can range anywhere from, you know, $500-600 up to, you know, a few thousand, you know, depending on the complexity of it. One of the big things, it just determines the type of exchange, but we can also talk about, you know, the different types of exchanges that are out there. So usually that's the general cost, and what, you know, that goes to the QI to be able to make sure things are in play, working with the title companies, the closing companies, preparing stuff for your CPA to be able to report it properly, you know, holding funds in trust and escrow for you so that you don't have constructor of receipt, keep you on the 45-day timeline. So those costs can vary just depending on how it looks, you know, and it could be just depending on what you're selling for, how many properties are involved in that. You know, I think the big thing to look at is the cost I'm paying for that relative to what I'm going to pay in taxes.
Okay.
Probably without, you know, that's probably a lot more beneficial than shelling out, you know, $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 in taxes, and I'm paying $1,000, right? So something like that, you know.
It just becomes part of the closing cost.
Yeah.
Cost of doing business.
Yeah.
Cost of doing business, plus you might be able, working with your CPA, to deduct that cost, you know, as an expense for the sale as it is anyway.
Okay.
So,
I didn't
you know,
know
just
that.
like any other kind
That's
of closing
true.
costs on it. So, you know, from that end. So it's pretty minimal along those lines to be able to do it.
We've been talking about like sort of your traditional run-of-the-mill 1031 exchanges, but I do get calls from people where they're not really anticipating getting into this situation, but they find a property they really want first, but they have to sell something else. So what happens if they do it backwards? Is that possible, or?
Yeah, so so your traditional 1031 is I'm selling my property first, and then I'm going to use those funds to buy a replacement property.
Yeah.
So we do have something you can structure a 1031, which is called a reverse exchange. So that's where you can actually buy first before you sell. So obviously you have to have the funds to be able to purchase first in that regard. And so what happens is, in the reverse exchange, now we're getting really more detailed into it, but you can't have title to both properties at the same time. So in the reverse exchange, we're creating an LLC, doing an exchange, a combination title holder to temporary hold title on that purchase. And then from that date, you know, we talked about those time frames you have, that 45-day, 180. So in the reverse exchange, you're not really stuck then with that 45-day. You already know what you're selling, but you then have 180 days to try to then sell your relinquished property. And then at that point, then we would then either transfer interest in the exchange accommodation title over to you to complete the exchange, or transfer via deed to you, and that completes the exchange. And so you see a lot of the reverse, and a lot of it we talk about the way the market is, right? So if it's a buyer's market or seller's market, how does that all come into play? And that kind of, now knowing that you have this reverse exchange aspect in play. So if it is a high, fast-paced market, it's a seller's market, and so you found this property, you don't want it to go too quick, you can buy it first, and now you're in that perfect market for you to be able to sell within the 180 days along those lines. So we have the reverse exchange, which is another great tool, that investors can use if they know where that property is and they have to move on it quick, from that end. And then they have that 180 days to try to sell the relinquished property.
So on that, again, going back to investment to investment, you can't say, oh, I'm selling my primary residence, but I want to buy, this property in the mountains. And
correct.
So it has to be investment to investment.
For investment, right, or used in a trade or business right, from that end.
I met you in a fast food restaurant.
It wasn't good fast food. It wasn't
casual.
Fast food. It was
not fast casual.
It was healthy.
Fast casual food. Yeah, healthy food, right?
Healthy.
Exactly.
Yeah, we try.
Tell us a little bit about you, because I haven't really, we've literally just talked 1031 exchanges. We sat down together, had our meal, exchanged contact information, and talked 1031 exchanges, and then had to split, right? So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so, about myself and the company. So I started... I'm a certified exchange specialist, so it's a designation that we get, so that people can get, to be able, qualified intermediaries can get to help, establish themselves in that type of in the market as a qualified intermediary. But the company, we are nationwide, full service qualified intermediary. Company was founded by my father-in-law, real estate attorney here in Florida, probably about 40 years ago.
Wow.
And so, through the change, COVID times and everything, I kind of came in. Obviously, we wanted to keep it in family, so I started working for them, and just started to learn the business probably about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago with
Excellent.
that. So just kind of running it, have great teachers with both, my wife being an attorney, real estate attorney, and my father-in-law being a real estate attorney, just teaching me the knowledge of everything that needs to know to go into to do that. So that's kind of how I fell into it, right? You don't wake up and go to school and say, I want to be a qualified intermediary, from that. So, and the beauty is it's just so niche of a market that you have to know about working with realtors, tax professionals on it, because it's just this little niche in the tax code that's so beneficial for people to be able to utilize if they know about it.
It's definitely an affluent product,
No, it's and that's one of the misconceptions. It's used for the rich, or the wealthy are the only ones that use it. And it's not necessarily the case. You have your mom and pop who might just have that seasonal rental. We're here in Sarasota, right here on the island, right?
Right.
Over in Siesta Key or Anna Maria, and it's been in their family. They just rent it out seasonally from that end, and eventually they want to move or change. Times are changing. And so it's not necessarily just for that ultra wealthy person who's selling multi-million-dollar commercial properties. It's that mom and pop who has that one investment property. Everyone knows how much real estate's being is appreciating, in the market, and everyone's trying to get into real estate, right? It's one of those things
it's
that
true.
seem.
Yeah.
Tomorrow I've got my youngest buyers ever. They're like 20 years old. They're buying a duplex tomorrow. I'm closing on it. And I just love that. Like, buyers are getting younger and younger, and this kid is showing me his crypto. He's got crypto. He's like, I'm buying some gold, and he's like, now I'm gonna buy my first real estate property. And I'm like, what do you do? He's like, I sell cell phones. I'm like,
Yeah. No,
and he's like taking every penny he has, and he's literally just reinvesting it. And he's like, this is missing out of my portfolio is real estate. So
right.
I'm like, this is awesome. And I think that more and more younger demographic are consuming this kind of content. So
yeah, no, it's again, and a lot of it with the 1031 is just educating people. Even then, your older folks, they just might not know about it, and it's just educating them. Talking with their CPA, make sure it makes sense for them, because again, it's just one part of the tax picture. And I think anyone who wants to sell investment property, what are my taxes going to be on that? No one wants to pay the tax man. Let's be real, right?
Right,
so,
right.
So what options do we have, and how can that come into play?
Well, in the short time I've gotten to know you, I mean, it's all about know, like, and trust, right? We want to know who you are, we trust you, and we're opening up, our personal, trying to figure it out, and you're trying to build a team. So you get a good realtor, you get a good attorney, you get 1031, and now you can kind of start filling out, you can read on the internet, you can chat GPT all you want, but until you're talking to people face to face and really understand the process, because you don't know until you pull triggers, right? And you got to have that comfortable partner with you on that. So I think that's what's great about what you're doing. You're straight up saying, hey, this is what we do. We've owned it. I'm learning it. We're getting better every day. How can we help your situation? And I think, and I just introduced it to somebody who was an investor. He's been investing 10 years, bought one property. And he's like, I'm going to sell it. I'm going to pay taxes. Like, you 1031 that? And he goes, what's that? So it's ironically that people will buy a couple properties and not even know.
Right.
How to save money.
Or even the realtor doesn't know, and that's part of our education process, because, there's so many more advantages from a realtor to know about 1031s, niching themselves in a market that I'm sure is just saturated with a bunch of people. How do you make yourself different than Marius over here? How do you, from that end? And so that's where the 1031 can come into play, because there's so many little nuances that come into play, but just being able to identify it. And from our end, we always say, look, we're here to help you with your client, right? We're no different. You're going to have, hey, here's who I recommend for a home inspector. Here's who I recommend for a roofer, landscaping people, plumbers, all inspection people. And so we just want to be that extra person in your tool belt that you're going to give that client if it makes sense for them, depending on their situation. That's what we really pride ourselves, that and the service that we can provide. We're not the largest, but we're boutique, and we pride ourselves in service, being able to answer the calls, being there for them, guiding them, really being that counselor, guidance, and working with them and their CPA. We're happy to get on a call with a client and their CPA and talk through the process to make sure, does this fit in? Does this align? What that process is going to be for them. And that's what we really pride ourselves on.
All right. So we've got our foreign buyers here. Can they participate in the 1031 exchange, and can they use those funds outside of the United States?
Yeah. So foreign investors can do a 1031. Obviously they're reporting the income to the IRS. There's some things that they have to be concerned about, obviously FIRPTA and other factors that will come into play. So again, we would have that discussion. How does FIRPTA come into play when it comes to taxes and so forth? That would come in through the 1031. But foreign investors who have investment property, you might have someone from Canada who has investment property here, and they want to sell it and buy other investment property here, so they can effectively do a 1031, just because, even though they are considered foreign from that standpoint, there's FIRPTA that would be involved in on the sale, but they also are reporting that sale to the IRS for that. And so they can do it. Now, can they buy property outside back in Canada, or can you as a U.S., I'm selling a property here, can I buy something outside? And the answer to that is no from that end. So this like-kind requirement that's in play is for, I can sell U.S. property and buy U.S. property from that end. I can't sell U.S. property and buy foreign property. Now, can I sell foreign property and buy foreign property? That satisfies the like-kind requirement. So there's no restrictions from that. You just can't cross domestically to international in that regard.
And is that a separate whole company that does Italy to Italy? You guys,
so others might do that, because you got to remember, there's exchange rates, I'll be honest, we're not going to open a bank account in Italy to hold funds from there. So more than likely, a U.S. company probably has some kind of banking relationship if they're even able to be able to handle something like that. So, but yeah.
We're going to kind of wrap up today. Is there any kind of last things that people should know about 1031s that we haven't hit, or?
No, I think, like I said, there's so many nuances with it. We're always making ourselves available, so please reach out to us, give us a call. We'll take the time, sit on the call with you. We don't charge a fee for a consult. We're here to help educate and discuss things with them. So, from that end, I would just say start planning early. If you know you're going to do it, get the questions answered, reach out, talk. We'll talk with your CPA. Does things make sense? Because in the end, we want it to make sense for someone. But start early. That's always the process. We think from that end. You don't want to wait until the last minute. Oh, we're at closing, and wait, we're just learning about this. So though we can help you as long as you haven't closed. But yeah,
just reach out, and we'll leave your information down below, and make sure they can reach out. So we appreciate you coming in.
No,
Thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Marius.
Thank you.
You know.